Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. I want to make some comments to sort of help you head into the weekend with a maybe clearer grasp of these dueling influences, the strain, the movement or consciousness, environmental consciousness evident in the conservation brand of environmentalism, and then also the preservation brand of environmentalism. And today in class we talked at some length about conservation. This was our objective. I'm just going to click through these slides, so if you needed to brush up your notes, you can pause and do so. We were talking essentially about conservation and preservation and how we can think about these different movements or consciousnesses in terms of the basis that brought them about, the general forces of history that sort of brought this level of consciousness about at the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Also their belief about markets, about technology, and then the form they took, the people and the types of interest groups that helped carry these ideas forward. And in class I did indicate briefly that there's nothing in and of itself that one could be conservationist and preservationist at the same time. Generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that based on people's different philosophies, they tend to align themselves a little more closely with one or the other, but they don't have to be, in essence, exclusive. So I left off today, we were introducing preservation, and here's our definition for preservation. And I was telling a little story about the movie Scent of a Woman, which hardly any of you had seen, and I strongly encourage you to go out and see it if you haven't yet. It's a great film, I think. But there's a reference, as I mentioned. The brief plot summary, we have this cantankerous, grouchy old man who's retired military, has a very jaded and distrustful view of the world, and he has resolved to take all the money that he has, pension and otherwise, and he's going to go just live all out for a week. And I think he goes to Atlantic City, if I'm not mistaken. I can't be sure of where their destination is. But he has essentially a assistant who his family has hired to be with him because this gentleman is aged and decrepit in some respects. And so this young, sort of innocent, fresh-faced boy joins him. And at the high point of the movie, there is a showdown where the older gentleman, played by Al Pacino, is attempting to take his own life, and the young man is unwilling to let him do it and stands in the way. And Pacino makes the reference and calls him a little snail darter. And what this refers to is the snail darter was a fish used in the late 20th century. It was a fish that environmentalists used to essentially prevent and stop the construction of a hydroelectric project. And it was determined that there was, the snail darter habitat was very unique to this area, and if the project were to proceed and be carried out, that it would be at the detriment to snail darter habitat, and the snail darter had very few habitat alternatives. And so if you understand that little bit of environmental history behind that reference, then it makes sense how this young man was standing in the way of this older gentleman's plans and prevented him from carrying them out. And so it starts to make sense when you have that literary reference, or I should say that historical reference. So now you know. All right, so moving on. Factors influencing preservation. Well, population for one. So we talked with the conservationists that were in the late 19th century realizing that the frontier or the boundless space of the American West has become saturated and filled by the late 1800s. A similar phenomenon drives the preservationists, but it's a little more specific. We've talked a little bit about the industrialization and the urbanization that happens by the late 1800s in the United States, and this whole idea of the city as wilderness, meaning the city as this sort of desolate, harsh, forbidding place starts to plant itself in the minds of, I think, many people in the United States. But another response is that if the city is dirty and polluted and a source of anguish and frustration and offers very little to the soul, well then perhaps nature can provide that antidote, or I should say, antidote to that harshness of the city. And so really the preservationists emerge and their values emerge out of the excesses of the capitalist industrial revolution and the intense process of urbanization. And we see this really evident in the arguments of Thoreau too in the mid-19th century. But more and more people are embracing this by the late 1800s and early 1900s. Going along with this process of intense industrialization and urbanization is the role of markets. And essentially the markets of this industrial capitalist regimen are really concentrating wealth and opportunity intensely in the hands of not such a wide segment of American society. And, those people who are paying attention and following along and seeing the explosion of monopolies and trusts that are essentially emerging, and handfuls of people are becoming incredibly wealthy, and much larger cross-sections of the population are not faring very well. And so the exploitation of natural resources for this industrial process does help people realize, it raises awareness in the minds of a growing segment of American society that, hey, what are we losing here? What's being lost in this process of intense industrialization? So I would say it's fair to know that one of the dramatic differences between conservationists and preservationists is sort of their views of technology. We know that conservationists relied on technology and saw it as a means to become more efficient and to thereby allow, to do more with the same. For preservationists, technology is more of a symbol of this mass industrial process that has brought about and has, despoiled nature and the natural resources of the United States. And so there's not as much faith in technology among the preservationists. They tend to feel like technology happens at the expense of the human spirit and human basic well-being. And then the interspace partnership. So, the preservation project is going to take the form of things like the National Park Service, which is founded in 1916. But there are all sorts of groups that form around the late 1800s and early 1900s, and many of them are still around today. For example, the Boy Scouts was founded in 1907. The Boone and Crockett Club goes all the way back to 1885. The Audubon Society, which started in New York, was founded in 1886. You've already heard a little bit about the Sierra Club, which was formed in 1892. So there's really kind of some growing networks and support groups for this new and budding expression of Americans' respect and regard for their natural environment. So the preservation principles, unlike conservation, which really values utility and values efficiency and values doing more with less, or at least with the same amount of something. For preservationists, it's more, we need to have these places that serve as sanctuaries that are more or less untouched, that's ultimately what's going to serve the human spirit and serve it well. And so folks like John Muir, and you could describe John Muir, you've already observed him a little bit, he's almost, in many respects, like a missionary. He's a missionary spreading the gospel of wild places and the gospel of preserving wilderness and pristine nature. And his idea is that when we spend time in nature, there is a transformation that takes place. We become better people. We become more authentic and original people. We become unique people. We remain unique people, unlike in the face of our industrial urban environment that is consuming or becoming, the United States is becoming more and more industrial and urbanized. Well, these preserved places are the antidote for that. Famous preservationists. Here you see a picture of John Muir and President Roosevelt. And I think it's fair to say that Teddy Roosevelt was kind of both conservationist and preservationist. He's kind of an interesting crossover person. Frederick Law Olmsted, you might recognize his name. He's actually responsible for designing Central Park in New York. And if you've ever been to Central Park in New York, you know it's not your typical park. It's a vast park. And it even has parts that sort of function almost as though they are preserved space, despite being somewhat smack dab in the middle of a major metropolitan area. George Catlin, Henry David Thoreau, these are all sort of the predecessors to the emergence of preservation toward the late 1800s and early 1900s. And we should note that in 1964, this is of course a long time after the the turn to 1900 and the years of John Muir's life, but the Wilderness Act is in many respects a final expression, or maybe the highest expression, of this preservationist ideal, in the sense that an act of Congress was passed that allowed the United States to set aside parts of land that were not to be used for any sort of industrial or market purpose. The Wilderness Act is essentially area that's set aside. It's even in some ways more sacred than the National Park Service. Wilderness, by and large, does not have roads. Tends to be roadless area. There are trails and some roads, but for the most part, wilderness is a highly protected status of land set-asides. Okay, so here you have just briefly the arguments that Roderick Nash put forward for the basis and the importance of wilderness for our lives in the modern world, and in many respects I think you find in here an argument on behalf of preservation, a preservationist mindset. Okay, with that we will call it good, and I will look forward to seeing you on Monday.